Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. The rain just stopped here at the Waterloo Farm Museum, and we say thanks to them for hosting us, but if it had rained, we'd have kept going here. My friend John, who's a CWDD coffee grinder, is with us, and today we're going to talk about something that affects both of us, and if you're in the living history hobby, could affect you as well. This is the beginning of a two-part series about campaigning in the wet and cold. Okay, well, events over the years have gotten some real reputations, from Wauhatchie to the last night at Piney was at 200 yards, Fort Blakely. There's just tons of them, and we could spend tons of time picking apart who did well and who didn't do well at what, but it really doesn't matter. The big thing for us is to look at accounts from soldiers and look at practical experience in the living history field and look at how we can do things better. A good friend of mine is a retired Marine sergeant, and he always pointed out to me, you can go a lot farther than you think, and you can go uncomfortable and still exist. Sometimes in the hobby, we talk about embrace the suck. John and I were at Averill's Advance a couple of years together ago, where he was my bugler. We spent two really cold nights, but there's some practical lessons even from that event that we were talking about before we started shooting here that was great. Two-part series. The first part is shelter. Just in general concept, okay, shelter. Put it up if you have it. Look, we're all used to going to living history events, checking our phones, checking the weather on the computer, watching TV, whatever it is, and going, it's going to be like this for the weekend. And then you might make a choice, well, I'm not going to put my tent up, or if I'm Confederate, I'm not going to put a fly up. Soldiers back then didn't have that option and didn't have that mindset. If you had shelter, put it up. Matter of fact, the first source that we're going to hear is Private Jackman from the 9th Kentucky, and he talks about setting up shelter.
The next day, we marched 4 or 5 hours further towards Murfreesboro and camped. The weather looked so favorable that evening, we neglected to pitch our tent, and were well paid for our negligence. That night at a late hour, a heavy rainstorm came up, and perfect rivers were running under us from that till morning. Of course, rested badly. Private John Jackman, 9th Kentucky.
Well, there's a veteran from the Confederate side talking about setting up shelter. On the Federal side, in early 1862, the Army starts getting shelter tents like you see behind me and John. Harmon Camburn from the 2nd Michigan, who we've done a few episodes on, wrote on the peninsula about one morning crawling out of his shelter tent and seeing General Barry and other officers sleeping under a tree. Generals having the bigger tentage, probably the wagons didn't come up, and here's a concrete example of enlisted men setting up shelter, even at a point when the general officers didn't have it. When you set up your shelter, let's make sure of a couple of things. If at all possible, get a windbreak going, and if you're allowed to, get the shelter turned so the wind is not going through. Take it on the side of the shelter, not running through. Again, you want to stay as warm as possible. Let's talk about types of shelter. Since we're dealing primarily with the campaign aspect, we will let the Sibley tents and the common tents go for now because we don't often have the wagons to move them. In this world, you're going to end up finding one of two things. In the Federal Army, you're going to find the good shelter tent after 1862 with several different variants. You see this all the way through. In our case, you've seen that John has helped me put it up here. We've buttoned the two halves together, and then the tent got set up. Absolutely important to do that. Let's go ahead and go over to the Confederate area of today's display, and we can take a look at what the Confederacy had because they didn't have the shelter half unless it was captured. Well, we've moved over, and this piece of canvas behind me is a lot larger. This is the Confederate Fly, and our friend Chad has his equipment set up underneath it. One look at it shows you that you sleep a lot more men underneath it, but it's not carried by the soldiers. This still has to be moved by the wagons. Matter of fact, Private Jackman from the 9th Kentucky talks about when the Flies showed up one day.
Today, our wagons came up from Resaca. Johnny Green and I immediately fixed up our Fly. We had no tent, by weatherboarding the back end and building a large fire in front. At night, we had our blankets spread down on a bed of leaves and slept in a strong wind, 40 miles an hour.
This is fantastic. You want to learn more about the Confederate Flies, we have to take our hats off to the fellas at the Liberty Rifles. They've got great research. There's an article on their website about the history of the Fly, its production, and if you want to go ahead and make one for yourself, there's directions there. It's one-stop shopping from history to interpretive, all in one space. Check out that article. Well, as we come back from the Confederate camp, one last thing to say about shelters is if you have a choice, and you may not because of where your event is at, sometimes sites won't allow this, you want to trench around the edges of your tent, your fly. If it rains, you want the water to roll into that and then run away from you, not roll off the side of your shelter and then underneath you. That's going to make yourself a lot more comfortable. Okay, moving on. I'm kneeling on the next piece of our discussion, and that is the gum blanket, or in Confederate cases, oilcloths or other waterproof layers of the sort. The gum blanket certainly is the gold standard during the Civil War. Let's go ahead and turn it over. Vulcanized rubber, we've done different episodes with Mike Washner about rubberized goods. This was a true hit to the soldiers. Goodyear patent. The gum blanket is generally issued to the infantry. Some people want to use a poncho, often given to cavalry and artillery. But the bottom line is, for me, if I have a choice, I want the thing without the slit in the middle of it. This is going to ward water off you, whether you use it on the bottom, like we've got it laid out here, and we'll see how that happens later on, or if you put it on top of your tent or on top of yourself when you're sleeping, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The other time that a gum blanket comes in handy is on the march. I can tell you that when we were at Wauhatchie, the Federals were on the march when the rain started. But it's not just a reenactor and living historian's experience. The soldiers ran into this. Let's listen to John Billings talk about this out of Hardtack and Coffee.
The Army on the march in a rainstorm presented some aspects not seen in fair weather. As soon as it began to rain, or just before, each man would remove his rubber blanket from his roll or knapsack and put it over his shoulders, tying it in front. Some men used their shelter tent instead, a very poor substitute, however. But there was no fun in the marching business during the rain. It might settle the dust. It certainly settled about everything else. An order to go into camp while the rain was in progress was not much of an improvement, for the ground was wet, fence rails were wet, one's woolen blanket was likely also to be wet, hardtack in the haversack wet. In fact, nothing so abundant and out of place as water. John Billings.
Well, okay, let's move on. The next piece comes with a caveat, but it is absolutely important if the weather is cold, and it'll help you if the weather is wet. That is your top layer jacket, your overcoat, your greatcoat. Federals have an issue coat for both enlisted men and foot, and for mounted services. Confederacy, you'll often see different versions of civilian jackets. In any situation, this is a top layer wool jacket. It has multiple layers of wool. It's fantastic for wearing in camp. It is less so on the march. You can wear it, but you need to be very cautious when you wear this marching. You will get very warm very fast. Hey, it's cold out, very warm, very fast. That's not necessarily good once you start sweating. In other things in my world, I was taught stand cold, march warm. You don't want to get too warm because you're going to get sweated, and when you stop, you're going to cool fast and not be able to keep the heat in because your own sweat is going to work against you. That's not just a 21st century issue. Private Jackman from the 9th Kentucky talks about this situation.
We immediately fell in and advanced in a line of battle, over a rocky ravine and through an old field, where the weeds were up to our shoulders and so thick we could hardly march. The evening was warm, and I had a heavy overcoat on, which, with tugging through the weeds, caused me to nearly suffocate. I pulled it off once with the intention of abandoning it, but again picked it up and buckled it under my belt. Well, I did so, for afterwards, it came in good place.
Well, as we come back on the overcoat and move on to the next part, sleeping, the one thing to say about the overcoat is we recommend that you not wear it to bed. It's going to hold only your heat. And let's talk about a way to sleep. You're normally going to do this inside the tent or under your shelter, but we've brought it back outside so that we can talk about it. We're going to talk about the concept of spooning. This is something very common to soldiers and very common in the 19th century. Remember, houses are not heated by central air. Fireplaces are on the edge of the room, often drafty. It's a lot colder at night. People sleep together. There's actually the humorous story where Stonewall Jackson complains about Jeb Stuart coming to bed with his spurs still on. people are used to sleeping together, not just spouses, but men with men, women with women, or people traveling together, because it's how to stay warm. Spooning is what soldiers did to stay warm. John and I have pulled our things out. This is something not unusual to us. Let's look at how it goes. First thing you're gonna do, you want an oilcloth or your gum blanket on the bottom. Keep the cold and wet off the ground. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna take my blanket and we're gonna toss it out here. When you talk about quality reproductions, one of the great things about a good federal blanket is it's going to help keep you warm. This is my Woodburn mount blanket, and I have a hard time, even though I have other blankets, going with anything else. A quality blanket is a huge help. Next, in the middle goes the us. So John and I come into here. Other pieces that we have are, we have our nightcaps. John has his, I have mine. This was made by Ray Evans over in England. Many of us know her. There's different styles, some with wool, many are knitted, some are made out of material. It doesn't matter, get what works for you. Then, as you see, now we have another, we can throw jackets over the two of us, or we can throw the wool blanket on next, and that pretty much, there's no manual to this, so it's what's gonna work with you. Another thing that I will recommend, and this is a big deal for me, we're doing this quickly right here to show you, if I'm sleeping, but especially in the cold, I'm taking my leather shoes off. The last thing I want is the cold of the leather to surround and trap my feet and make my feet cold at night. We're gonna get so we can wrap up and wrap in here. Then John's blanket comes into play higher up. We're making sure, again, we get wrapped in. Were we going to bed, I'd be taking my brogans off. I'm gonna say it again because it's just important. And then finally on top, we talked about the gum blanket helping you both as a bottom layer and as a top layer. Even inside the tent, we're gonna do this to trap. And then when we lay down, we are right next to each other. And since we're under a common blanket and over a common blanket, all the heat stays trapped and we're gonna be able to stay warmer and work in a much colder temperature. Additional pieces that we have are gonna go ahead and be put on. If you don't have gloves, this is a quick trick. Have a spare pair of socks. They're gonna trap heat in your hands. Put them over your cuffs. You're gonna keep your wrist warm. You're gonna do better. So, well, there's a first look at campaigning in the cold and wet. We've talked about shelter. We've gone ahead and we've talked about the different pieces that keep you warm. When we come back next time, we're gonna talk about materials and we're gonna talk about some accessories and techniques. But for here, you can do it. There's no problem. You'll be able to have a good event. You'll have a good experience. It'll give you a better connection to the soldier from the war. We're gonna go to bed now. See you later.